My name is Thea Bennett, and I am 31 years old, a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in downtown Chicago, where I spent 45 hours a week meticulously balancing the books for people who have never known the sharp, metallic taste of financial desperation. At precisely 10:14 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning, in a 12 by 15-foot wood-paneled office that smelled faintly of expensive cigar tobacco and old parchment, my entire identity was dismantled by a man in a charcoal suit. Thea is not a Bennett, the lawyer, Marcus Thorne, stated with a clinical coldness that made the air in the room turn to ice. Her father is Judge Douglas Prescott. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, muffled hum of traffic on Wacker Drive and the rhythmic ticking of a mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. My sister Vivian, who is 35 and currently draped in a $450 black silk Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress that she likely charged to our late mother's credit card, let her jaw drop in a way that felt more theatrical than genuinely surprised. My brother, Kyle, a 28-year-old who has never managed to hold a steady job for longer than a single 180-day probationary period in his life, abruptly stopped smirking at his titanium-framed iPhone 15 Pro. For 27 years, they had treated me like the stain on the family tapestry, the dull gray pebble among the polished marble of the Bennett legacy. And now, with one sentence, I had been legally excised from their lineage. I sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable, stiff-backed leather chair, my spine pressing against the cold upholstery as I processed the gravity of what had just been revealed. For my entire life, I had lived in the shadow of the Bennett name, a name that carried the weight of 3 generations of real estate development in the Midwest. My mother, Constance Bennett, had passed away on an operating table at St. Jude's Medical Center at exactly 8:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, following a complicated cardiovascular procedure that her 72-year-old body simply couldn't withstand. She was a woman who navigated life with the precision of a surgeon and the empathy of a blizzard, and 3 days before her heart finally gave out, she had summoned Marcus Thorne to her bedside to perform one last act of calculated cruelty. She had updated her will to ensure that Vivian and Kyle would inherit the sprawling $4 million estate in Lake Forest, the diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and the collection of vintage Rolex watches, while I was left with absolutely nothing but a single, cream-colored envelope made of heavy 80-pound linen cardstock. She thought that stripping me of the Bennett inheritance would be the final crushing death blow to my spirit, a way to punish me for never being as pliable or as performative as my siblings. She didn't realize that by cutting me out, she had inadvertently handed me the key to a door I hadn't even known existed. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to understand the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, I have to take you back to the way the Bennett household actually functioned. We lived in a house that was perpetually ready for a photo shoot that never happened, a place where the scent of lemon-scented furniture polish was more prevalent than the smell of actual cooking. My father, or the man I had believed was my father until 10 minutes ago, Arthur Bennett, had died when I was 6, leaving Constance to reign over us with a terrifying, quiet efficiency. Vivian was always the golden child, the one who took ballet and spoke 3 languages and married a man whose last name opened doors at country clubs. Kyle was the protected son, the one whose gambling debts were quietly paid off from a secret ledger and whose repeated failures were rebranded as soul-searching. And then there was me, the quiet one, the one who worked 3 jobs during college to avoid the strings attached to the family checkbook, the one who currently pays $1,200 a month for a 650-square-foot apartment in a building where the radiator clanks like a dying engine every time the temperature drops below freezing. Now, let me take you back to the hospital room at St. Jude's, 72 hours before Constance breathed her last. The room was bathed in the harsh, unflattering glow of fluorescent lights, and the air was thick with the sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol and the mechanical wheeze of a ventilator. I had been sitting in the corner, my fingers numb from the cold, watching the jagged green line of her heart rate monitor on the Philips IntelliView monitor. Vivian and Kyle were in the cafeteria, likely arguing over who would get the vacation home in Aspen. Constance opened her eyes, her pupils dilated and hazy from the morphine drip, and she looked at me not with a mother's love, but with a strange, flickering intensity that bordered on contempt. "You were always the interloper," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You have his eyes, and every time I looked at you, I saw the lie I had to live." She didn't explain further. She simply gestured toward the nightstand where the cream-colored envelope sat, sealed with a drop of red wax that bore the imprint of her signet ring. "That is your inheritance, Thea. It is all you are worth to this family." The memory of that moment burned in my mind as I looked at Marcus Thorne, who was now adjusting his silver-rimmed spectacles and clearing his throat to continue reading the legal documents. The office felt smaller now, the wood-paneled walls closing in as Vivian began to find her voice. "This is some kind of joke, right?" she hissed, her manicured fingers gripping her designer handbag so tightly the leather creaked. "You're saying our mother was an adulteress? That this accountant isn't even a real Bennett?" The disgust in her tone was palpable, a physical weight in the room. Kyle finally looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from confusion to a predatory sort of glee. "So she gets nothing? No share of the Lake Forest house? No cut of the trust? Man, Mom really hated you more than we thought." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that lacked any real humor, and for a second, I felt the familiar sting of being the outsider, the one who was always just barely tolerated at the Thanksgiving table where the centerpiece cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I reached out and picked up the cream-colored envelope that Marcus had placed on the mahogany desk. It felt surprisingly heavy in my hand. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper with the letterhead of the Illinois Superior Court and a handwritten note from Constance. The note was brief, written in her elegant, sharp-edged cursive. "Douglas Prescott never wanted a daughter, and I never wanted his mistake. Now you both have what you deserve. Judge Douglas Prescott." The name resonated in my mind with the force of a gavel hitting a bench. Everyone in the state knew who Judge Prescott was. He was a man of immense power, a legal titan who resided in a gated manor in Hinsdale that was rumored to have its own private library and a wine cellar worth 6 figures. He was a man who preached about family values and the sanctity of the law from the highest benches in the land. And yet, I was his secret, a piece of evidence he had spent 31 years suppressing. I looked down at my own hands, noticing for the first time how much they resembled the hands I had seen in newspaper photos of the judge, long-fingered and steady. My mind began to calculate the numbers with the cold, analytical precision of my profession. The Bennetts were wealthy, yes, but their wealth was tied up in aging properties and dwindling trusts that Vivian and Kyle would likely bleed dry within a decade through sheer incompetence and luxury car leases. But Douglas Prescott? His influence and his estate were on an entirely different level. By cutting me out of the Bennett will, Constance thought she was casting me into the wilderness, forcing me to survive on my meager senior accountant salary while my siblings lived in the lap of luxury. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of being nobody's daughter, a person without a lineage or a safety net. But as I sat there, listening to Vivian and Kyle begin to argue with Marcus about the logistics of the estate sale, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I wasn't just Thea Bennett, the girl who lived in a cramped apartment and wore off-brand shoes to save for a rainy day. I was the biological daughter of one of the most powerful men in the legal world, a man who had a lot to lose if the truth about his past ever came to light. The envelope wasn't just a revelation of my birth, it was a dossier of leverage. It contained the date and time of their meeting at the Drake Hotel in 1992, the name of the private clinic where the quiet arrangements had been made, and a copy of a non-disclosure agreement that Constance had signed, but evidently kept a copy of for her own protection. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, causing the leather chair to groan beneath me. The argument between my siblings died down as they looked at me, expecting tears or a plea for a small allowance from the estate. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't look at Vivian's smudged mascara or Kyle's arrogant posture. I simply tucked the cream-colored envelope into my leather briefcase, the one I had bought on sale at a department store 3 years ago, and walked toward the heavy oak door of the office. "Where do you think you're going?" Vivian called out, her voice rising in pitch. "We're not finished here. You still have to sign the waiver acknowledging you have no claim to the property." I paused at the door, my hand on the cold brass handle. I turned my head just enough to catch her eye, seeing the flicker of fear behind her bravado. "I don't need the Bennett name, Vivian," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors they expected. "And I certainly don't need your permission to leave. You can keep the house and the watches. I have something much more valuable." As I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the door clicking shut behind me felt like the end of a long, suffocating chapter. The hallway was long, lined with portraits of stern-faced men in robes, and my heels clicked against the marble floor with a newfound rhythm. I walked out of the building and into the cool, damp Chicago air, feeling the mist on my face. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, a charcoal wool blend that I had meticulously maintained for 5 winters, and started walking toward the nearest train station. I had 31 years of questions, a bank account that was far from empty because I knew how to manage every cent, and a cream-colored envelope that was about to turn Judge Douglas Prescott's carefully curated world upside down. My mother had spent her life trying to make me feel small, trying to ensure that I knew my place was at the bottom of the family hierarchy. She had used her final breath to try and erase me, to make me a ghost in my own life story. But as I watched the CTA train pull into the station, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the air, I realized that family isn't just the blood that runs through your veins or the name on a legal document. Family is the foundation you build for yourself when the people who were supposed to protect you decide to tear you down. Constance Bennett thought she was leaving me with nothing, but in her malice, she had given me the truth. And the truth, as any good accountant will tell you, is the only thing that ever truly balances the books in the end. I was no longer the girl waiting for a seat at a table that was never built for her. I was the one who was about to build a whole new table, and this time, I would be the one deciding who was worthy of a seat. Growing up in the Bennett household in the affluent, meticulously manicured suburb of Crestfield, Georgia, was an exercise in existing as a low-resolution glitch within a high-definition family photograph. Our home was a sprawling 5-bedroom Georgian colonial on Magnolia Drive, valued at approximately $1.2 million, featuring a wraparound porch and a lawn that was chemically treated every 3rd Tuesday of the month to maintain a shade of green that didn't actually exist in nature. Inside those walls, the air was always chilled to exactly 68 degrees, and the silence was often punctuated by the soft, rhythmic ticking of a handcrafted Howard Miller floor clock that sat in the grand foyer. To any outsider looking through the thermal pane windows, we were the quintessential Southern success story, but for me, life was lived in the peripheral shadows of my siblings' brightly lit trajectories. Vivian, who is 4 years my senior, was the living embodiment of the Bennett brand with her striking auburn hair that caught the afternoon sun like polished copper, and a wardrobe that consisted almost entirely of designer labels purchased during seasonal hauls at Phipps Plaza. When she decided to attend the University of Georgia, Constance didn't even blink before writing a check for her $85,000 tuition, covering every single credit hour, housing fee, and sorority dues in full, ensuring that Vivian never had to know the weight of a student loan or the indignity of a part-time job. My brother Kyle was similarly insulated from the frictions of reality, gifted a $42,000 Oxford White Ford F-150 Lariat for his 21st birthday, a vehicle he treated with a level of negligence that made my chest tighten every time I saw a new dent in the chrome bumper. Even now, well into his late 20s, and despite his chronic inability to maintain employment for more than a single fiscal quarter, he continues to receive a monthly allowance of $1,200, deposited like clockwork into his Wells Fargo checking account by Constance, who viewed his failures merely as charming eccentricities that required more financial padding. Then there was me, Thea, the girl with the deep olive skin and dark almond-shaped eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A face that matched no one in the ancestral gallery that lined the mahogany-paneled hallway. While Vivian and Kyle shared the same narrow noses and pale porcelain complexions that defined the Bennett lineage for 3 generations, I was a physical anomaly, a biological riddle that Constance seemed determined to leave unsolved. Every Sunday evening at precisely 6 p.m., we were required to gather for a formal dinner in the dining room, a space dominated by a heavy cherry wood table and a 24 by 36-inch oil-on-canvas family portrait that hung prominently over the marble fireplace. The portrait featured Arthur, Constance, Vivian, and Kyle, all smiling with a curated, effortless grace, their hands resting on each other's shoulders in a display of suburban solidarity. I was notoriously absent from that frame, and whenever a guest would politely inquire about the missing child, Constance would offer a thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes and say, "We simply ran out of space in the frame for Thea," her voice as smooth and cold as a river stone. It wasn't just a joke, it was a manifesto, a constant reminder that I was an addendum to their lives, a footnote that she found increasingly difficult to read. To survive the quiet erasure of my identity, I leaned into the only thing I could control: numbers. While my siblings spent their weekends lounging by the neighborhood pool or charging high-end electronics to Constance's Neiman Marcus card, I was working 30 hours a week at Miller's Hardware on the outskirts of Crestfield, earning $11.50 an hour. I spent my shifts surrounded by the smell of galvanized steel and sawdust, mixing gallons of Sherwin-Williams paint and helping contractors locate specific grades of lumber, my hands often stained with grease or covered in the fine dust of the trade. My goal was singular and uncompromising. I would pay for my own education. I maintained a 3.8 GPA at the local university, spending my nights in the quietest corner of the campus library, fueled by black coffee from a thermos and the burning desire to never owe Constance Bennett a single cent. Every penny I earned was meticulously tracked in a spiral-bound ledger I kept hidden under my mattress, divided into categories for tuition, books, and the maintenance of my vehicle. While Vivian's auburn hair whipped in the wind as she drove her brand-new convertible, and Kyle tore through the Georgia backroads in his truck, I drove a 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic with 142,000 miles on the odometer. The air conditioning was temperamental, often emitting a high-pitched whine when the Georgia humidity climbed above 90%, and the upholstery on the driver's seat was beginning to fray at the seams. But that car was mine in a way that nothing in the Magnolia Drive house would ever be. It was a vessel of independence, a mechanical testament to the fact that I could move through the world without their permission. But the contrast wasn't just in the machines we drove or the clothes we wore. It was in the very texture of our daily existence. I remember one specific afternoon in mid-July when the heat was so thick you could almost see it shimmering off the asphalt. I had just finished an 8-hour shift at the hardware store and walked into the kitchen to find Constance and Vivian surrounded by glossy shopping bags from Nordstrom and Saks Fifth Avenue. They were draped in silk and linen, laughing about a pair of $700 Jimmy Choo pumps that Vivian thought were just too darling to pass up. I stood there in my stained work polo and worn-out jeans, the smell of wood lacquer still clinging to my skin, and felt the immense cavernous distance between us. Constance looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my disheveled appearance with a flicker of genuine distaste, before she turned back to Vivian to discuss the menu for an upcoming charity gala. There was no question about my day, no offer of a cold glass of tea, no acknowledgement that I had just spent a third of my waking hours engaged in manual labor to fund a future they were simply handed on a silver platter. I went to the sink, washed the grime from my fingernails with lemon-scented dish soap, and retreated to my room, which felt less like a sanctuary and more like a holding cell. My room was the smallest in the house, a 10 by 10 space that overlooked the driveway, allowing me a front row seat to the constant arrivals and departures of the life I wasn't invited to lead. I would sit at my desk, a $30 find from a yard sale that I had sanded and repainted myself, and lose myself in the predictable, comforting logic of accounting principles. In the world of double-entry bookkeeping, everything had to balance. For every debit, there was a corresponding credit, and every error could eventually be found and corrected. It was the antithesis of my life at home, where the scales were permanently tipped and the errors were buried under layers of expensive wallpaper and social standing. The financial disparity was a weapon Constance used with surgical precision. She would frequently comment on the cost of the organic produce she bought for dinner or the rising property taxes on the Crestfield estate, all while sliding a fresh credit card across the counter to Kyle so he could take his friends out for a $300 steak dinner. She wanted me to feel the weight of my own self-reliance as if it were a burden rather than a badge of honor. "You're so determined to do it all yourself, Thea," she would say with a sigh that suggested my independence was a personal affront to her. "It's a shame you have such a hard, unyielding nature." What she called hard, I called structural integrity. I was building a foundation out of the very bricks they threw at me, ensuring that when I finally left Crestfield, I wouldn't leave a single footprint behind. I worked through every summer break, every spring holiday, and every weekend, watching the odometer on my Honda Civic climb higher and higher, a numeric countdown to my eventual escape. By the time I graduated with my degree in accounting, I had zero debt and a sense of self that was forged in the furnace of their neglect. I moved into a 650-square-foot apartment in a part of the city where the streetlights flickered and the neighbors were loud. But it was the first place I had ever lived where I didn't feel like a mistake that needed to be cropped out of a photo. Now, sitting in Marcus Thorne's office years later, the memories of those Sunday dinners and the hardware store shifts feel like they belong to another person. Yet the scars they left are what allow me to remain upright while Vivian and Kyle crumble. They were raised to be ornaments, fragile and decorative, dependent on the reflected light of the Bennett name to have any value at all. I was raised in the dark, forced to find my own light and my own worth in the cold, hard facts of reality. As Vivian adjusts her $450 dress and Kyle checks his $1,200 phone, I realize that they are the ones who are truly impoverished. They have spent their lives inheriting a lie, while I have spent mine earning the truth. The 2012 Honda Civic is long gone, replaced by a reliable but modest vehicle that reflects my tax bracket, but the girl who mixed paint and counted pennies is still very much alive inside of me. She is the one who recognized the quality of the 80-pound linen cardstock of the cream-colored envelope, and she is the one who will know exactly how to use the information inside to ensure that the Bennetts finally have to account for the space they tried to deny me. In the high-definition photo of their perfect life, I was the glitch that eventually crashed the entire system. And as I prepare to face Judge Douglas Prescott, I find that I am no longer interested in fitting into their frame. I am busy building a new world where the frame is large enough for the truth, and the truth is the only currency that matters. My mother thought she was leaving me with nothing, but she forgot that an accountant knows better than anyone that sometimes the most valuable assets are the ones that are kept off the balance sheet until the final audit. And the audit of the Bennett and Prescott families is only just beginning. The point of no return arrived at precisely 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday that smelled of damp pavement and the aggressive, burnt odor of $4 a pound coffee that Harold Marsh, attorney at law, served in chipped ceramic mugs. We were gathered in his office on the third floor of a pre-war building in downtown Crestfield, a space that felt perpetually trapped in 1985 with its sagging bookshelves, dusty law volumes, and windows that hadn't been cleaned since the last election cycle. Harold, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment and whose suit appeared 2 sizes too large for his fraying frame, sat behind a heavy oak desk that was cluttered with manila folders and a brass Scales of Justice paperweight. My sister Vivian sat to my left, crossing her legs in a way that showed off her $450 black silk Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress. while Kyle leaned back in his chair, tapping a rhythm on the armrest with his fingers, his eyes darting toward the titanium-framed iPhone 15 Pro in his pocket every few seconds. I sat between them, feeling like a stranger in a room full of people who shared my last name but none of my DNA, my senior accountant's brain already cataloging the estimated value of the assets we were about to discuss. Harold cleared his throat, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk, and began to read the final distribution of the estate of Constance Bennett, a document that had been finalized only 72 hours before her heart stopped beating at St. Jude's Medical Center. The reading was a systematic dismantling of my place in the family, a cold, calculated ledger of favoritism that left no room for interpretation. Vivian was awarded the 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath Georgian colonial on Maple Drive, a property currently valued at approximately $315,000, along with all the heirloom jewelry and the contents of the mahogany china cabinet. Kyle, to no one's surprise, was granted the 2024 Oxford Whiteford F-150 Lariat and the extensive collection of high-end power tools stored in the climate-controlled garage, items he would likely sell for 50 cents on the dollar within 6 months to fund his lifestyle. The remaining liquid assets, totaling $47,342 in a high-yield savings account at SunTrust, were bequeathed in their entirety to the Grace Community Church, a final act of public piety from a woman who had spent her private life practicing a much darker religion. And then there was me. Harold paused, his gaze lingering on a small, cream-colored envelope that looked out of place against the backdrop of official notarized documents. He didn't read a dollar amount or a property description. He simply slid the envelope across the desk toward me, his expression unreadable behind his silver-rimmed spectacles. Vivian leaned in, a sharp, triumphant smirk cutting across her face, her voice a low hiss that only I was meant to hear. "Mom always knew exactly what you were worth, Thea," she whispered, the scent of her expensive Chanel No. 5 perfume clashing with the bitter smell of the office coffee. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a flinch or a tear, nor did I look at Kyle, who was now grinning openly as if this were the punchline to a long-running joke. My fingers, steady and cold, reached for the envelope. The paper was heavy, a premium 80-pound linen cardstock that felt more like a weapon than a letter. I tore the flap with a single decisive motion, the sound of the paper ripping echoing in the small, wood-paneled room. Inside, there was no check, no deed, and no stock certificate. There was only a single slip of white paper with one sentence written in cheap, blue Bic ink, the handwriting sharp and jagged as if it had been forced onto the page in a moment of extreme duress or calculated malice. I read it once, then twice, the words burning into my retinue like a flashbulb in a dark room. It was a confession meant to exile me, a truth designed to strip away the very ground I stood on and leave me wandering in the wilderness of my own identity. But Constance Bennett had underestimated my capacity for silence. I didn't fold the paper and tuck it into my bag. I didn't run from the room in a fit of dramatic sobbing as she had likely envisioned. Instead, I straightened my posture, smoothed the charcoal wool of my blazer, and handed the slip of paper directly to Harold Marsh. "Read it," I said, my voice cutting through the stuffy air of the office with a clarity that surprised even me. "Read it out loud, Harold. I want every person in this room to hear the final word from the woman they so dearly loved." Harold hesitated, his eyes darting from me to the paper, and then to the expectant, greedy faces of Vivian and Kyle. He cleared his throat again, adjusted his glasses, and in a voice that trembled only slightly, he read the sentence that ended my life as a Bennett and began my life as something else entirely. "Thea is not a Bennett. Her father is Judge Douglas Prescott, and I leave her the truth because it is the only thing he cannot afford to lose." The silence that followed lasted for exactly 9 seconds, a vacuum of sound so profound that I could hear the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead and the distant, muffled siren of an ambulance 3 blocks away on Wacker Drive. Vivian's jaw didn't just drop. It hung open as she looked at me with a mixture of horror and sudden, visceral realization. her auburn hair falling over her shoulder as she searched my face for the lie she hoped was there. Kyle's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of bewildered confusion as his brain struggled to process the fact that the sister he had bullied for 20 years was the biological offspring of the most powerful man in the county. I wasn't the daughter of a real estate developer who had died when I was 6. I was the mistake of a legal titan, a man who sat on the highest bench in the state and dictated the moral and legal landscape for millions. I was the secret evidence of a lapse in judgment from a man whose entire career was built on the appearance of absolute, unassailable integrity. I sat there in the center of their shock, feeling a strange, cold sense of liberation wash over me. For 31 years, I had been the dark-eyed, olive-skinned anomaly in the Bennett family portraits, the girl who worked 30 hours a week at a hardware store to pay for an accounting degree while my siblings lived on credit and vanity. I had been the one who was told there wasn't enough room in the frame, the one who was excluded from the trust funds and the country club memberships, and now I knew why. I was a living, breathing liability that Constance had been paid or threatened to keep hidden within the confines of a respectable Southern family. Every Sunday dinner where she pointed to the portrait and mocked my presence was an act of psychological warfare intended to keep me small and uncurious. Every moment she spent ensuring I felt like a burden was a brick in the wall she had built to protect the reputation of Douglas Prescott. But as I looked at the cream-colored envelope, I realized that she had finally tired of the burden. Whether it was out of a deathbed desire for honesty or one final spectacular act of spite toward the man who had abandoned his child, she had handed me the detonator. Now, let me take you back to the feeling of that 9-second silence, because it was in those moments that I transitioned from a senior accountant with a 650-square-foot apartment and a modest savings account into a woman who possessed the most dangerous commodity in the state of Georgia. I looked at Vivian, whose $315,000 house suddenly seemed like a pittance, a consolation prize for a lifetime of being a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. I looked at Kyle, whose truck and tools were insignificant toys compared to the leverage I now held in my hands. They were the heirs to a crumbling facade, the beneficiaries of a woman who had lied to them every day of their lives. I was the heir to the truth. The blue Bic ink on that slip of paper was more than a confession. It was a roadmap to a life they couldn't even imagine. Judge Douglas Prescott lived in a gated manor in Hinsdale, a place with a private library and a wine cellar that cost more than my entire education, and he had spent 31 years believing that he had successfully buried the mistake of 1992. But as I stood up, the leather of the office chair groaning under the shift in weight, I felt the full power of my new identity settling into my bones. I didn't need the $315,000 or the truck or the $47,000 in savings. I had the name of a man who would do anything to keep me silent, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in being quiet. I tucked the slip of paper back into the cream-colored envelope and placed it carefully into my briefcase, the one I had bought on sale at a department store 3 years ago. I didn't say goodbye to Vivian or Kyle, nor did I acknowledge the stunned expression on Harold Marsh's face. I simply walked toward the heavy oak door, my heels clicking against the worn floorboards with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. As I stepped out of the office and into the cool, damp air of the hallway, I realized that family isn't about the name you are given at birth or the people who pretend to love you for the sake of appearances. Family is the truth you are willing to stand in, and for the first time in 31 years, I knew exactly where I stood. I was Thea Prescott, the girl they tried to erase, and I was about to walk right into the center of the frame they thought they had closed forever. Constance Bennett had meant for this to be my exile, but she had accidentally given me my kingdom. The audit of my life was finally over, and the results showed that the Bennetts were bankrupt while I was suddenly dangerously wealthy in ways that money could never quantify. As I reached the elevator, the doors sliding open with a soft, mechanical chime, I knew that my next stop wouldn't be my small apartment or my quiet office. It would be the gated manor in Hinsdale, and I wouldn't be knocking. I would be walking in as the owner of a truth that no judge in the world could ever rule against. That night, the air in my 650-square-foot apartment felt different, weighted with the chemical scent of cheap lemon floor cleaner and the heavy, humid heat of a Chicago summer that the rattling window unit in my bedroom was struggling to combat. I sat at my small laminate kitchen table, the surface chipped at the edges to reveal the compressed particle board beneath, and poured myself a generous glass of a $9 bottle of Barefoot Pinot Grigio I had picked up from the corner CVS on my walk home from the train station. The wine was acidic and lacked any real complexity, but it served its purpose as I opened my Dell Inspiron laptop and felt the familiar hum of the processor beneath my fingertips. My hands, usually so steady when navigating the complex tax codes and audit trails of my senior accountant position, hovered over the keyboard for several seconds before I finally typed the name that had rewritten my history: Douglas Prescott. I didn't just search for a person. I began an excavation of a legacy that had been intentionally buried beneath 31 years of Bennett family lies and Southern suburban artifice. The search results flooded the screen with a blue light that reflected off my glasses, revealing a man who wasn't just a name in a courtroom, but a titan of the Illinois legal system, a circuit court judge who had presided over the bench for 3 decades with a reputation for what the local newspapers called unwavering fairness and an ironclad commitment to the letter of the law. As I scrolled through the digital archives of the Chicago Tribune and the Daily Law Bulletin, I found his official judicial portrait, a high-resolution image that stopped the breath in my lungs. I leaned in closer to the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as I analyzed the facial structure of the man in the black robes. There it was, undeniable and haunting. The same subtle, downward tilt of the eyes that I saw in my own reflection every morning. The same narrow, aristocratic bridge of the nose that Constance had always claimed was a recessive trait from some distant, unnamed cousin, and the same set of the jaw that suggested a stubbornness that could move mountains. For my entire life, I had been told I was a glitch in the Bennett family photo, a physical anomaly that didn't fit the auburn-haired, pale-skinned mold of Vivian and Kyle, but the screen in front of me provided the high-definition proof that I was exactly who I was supposed to be. I discovered that Douglas Prescott had passed away exactly 2 years ago, following a brief battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving behind a sprawling 40-acre estate in Hinsdale and a widow named Beatrice, who was often photographed at charity galas wearing pearls that likely cost more than my annual salary. He had died without ever publicly acknowledging my existence, and as I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, the pieces of Constance's grand, twisted puzzle began to click into place with a sickening precision. She hadn't hidden me to protect me, nor had she kept the secret to preserve the sanctity of her own marriage to Arthur Bennett. She had hidden me as a weapon of slow-motion psychological warfare against the man who had refused to leave his wife for her. She had chosen to let me grow up in a house where I was treated as an unwanted interloper, a person who was told there wasn't enough room in the family frame, simply because she wanted to punish Douglas Prescott for his rejection. She would rather I be unloved and overlooked than allow me the status and security of being a Prescott, using my very life as a ledger of her own resentment. The realization should have brought tears, should have provoked a breakdown of the carefully constructed emotional walls I had built over the last decade, but I found that my eyes remained dry and my mind remained terrifyingly clear. I am an accountant. I do not deal in the currency of emotions. I deal in the cold, hard reality of assets, liabilities, and equity. I looked at the glass of cheap wine and then back at the screen, seeing the list of Prescott's charitable donations, his involvement in the Bar Association, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth he had left behind, wealth that should have, by any standard of biological equity, been partially mine. Every hardware store shift I had worked until my back ached, every penny I had pinched to pay for an accounting degree that my siblings were handed for free, and every moment I had spent feeling like a burden was a debt that was now overdue. Constance thought she was delivering a final death blow by leaving me a confession in a cream-colored envelope, but she had actually handed me a subpoena for a life that had been stolen from me. I moved the cursor with a deliberate, surgical grace, closing the browser tabs one by one until I was left with a blank desktop. I opened my primary Excel workbook, the one where I tracked my modest 5-year plan and my tightly managed monthly budget of $3,400. I didn't look at my rent or my utility bills. Instead, I clicked the small plus sign at the bottom of the screen to create a new tab. I renamed it with a single clinical word that felt like a declaration of war: restitution. This wouldn't be a journey of emotional reconciliation or a desperate search for a father figure who was already in the ground. This was an audit. I began to build a spreadsheet of 31 years of systemic neglect, calculating the cost of the tuition I had paid myself, the interest on the missed opportunities, and the market value of the inheritance that had been diverted to Vivian's designer dresses and Kyle's high-end trucks. I factored in the real estate values of the Hinsdale Manor, the estimated value of the Prescott trust funds, and the potential settlements for a lifetime of intentional emotional distress and fraud. As the clock on the microwave shifted to 12:42 a.m., the blue light of the laptop illuminating the small kitchen in a ghostly glow, I felt a sense of purpose that was more intoxicating than the Pinot Grigio. I wasn't the girl who was pushed out of the frame anymore. I was the one who was going to dismantle the gallery. I knew Douglas Prescott's legal firm, Prescott, Sterling and Associates, and I knew exactly where his widow lived, behind the wrought iron gates of a community that prided itself on its exclusivity. Constance had spent her final days ensuring I knew my father's name, thinking the shame of being an illegitimate mistake would keep me in the shadows. But she had forgotten that I had spent my entire career finding the money that people tried to hide. I was a senior accountant with a specialization in forensic analysis, and I was about to turn my professional gaze toward the Prescott estate. I thought about the 2012 Honda Civic I had driven into the ground, the one with the frayed seats and the whining air conditioner, and contrasted it with the sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class that the judge was seen stepping out of in a 2018 local news clip. The disparity was a physical weight, a debt that had been compounding for 3 decades, and I was the only one with the ledger. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing public records, property tax assessments, and probate filings, my fingers moving across the trackpad with a rhythmic, hypnotic speed. I wasn't just looking for money, I was looking for the cracks in the Prescott armor, the places where the unwavering fairness met the reality of a hidden daughter. By the time the first streaks of gray light began to filter through the smog of the Chicago skyline, my restitution tab was populated with figures that would make a corporate lawyer sweat. I had the dates, the locations, and the financial trail of the hush money that had likely been funneled to Constance through various offshore shell companies, a classic maneuver that my trained eyes could spot in a series of anomalous wire transfers mentioned in the Bennett estate's old records. My mother's handwriting in that blue Bic ink had been a confession. Yes, but it was also a roadmap. She thought she was exiling me to a life of perpetual wandering, but she had inadvertently given me the keys to a kingdom she had been too bitter to claim for herself. I stood up from the table, my joints stiff from the hours of focused labor, and walked to the window. I looked out at the city, at the thousands of lives being lived in the small, cramped spaces of their own making, and realized that I was no longer one of them. I was a Prescott, even if only by blood and betrayal, and I was going to ensure that the balance sheet of my life finally reached an equilibrium. The Bennetts could keep their $315,000 house and their tool sets. They were fighting over scraps while I was preparing to claim the feast. As I closed my laptop, the soft click of the lid felt like the closing of a casket on the girl I used to be. Thea Bennett, the overworked accountant in the small apartment, died that night at 10:14 a.m. Thea Prescott, the auditor of her own stolen legacy, was just getting started, and she didn't need anyone's permission to take what was hers. I would walk into the lion's den of Hinsdale not as a victim, but as the inevitable consequence of 31 years of unpaid debts, and I would not stop until every cell in my restitution spreadsheet was highlighted in green. The audit was no longer a theoretical exercise, it was a mission, and the first item on the agenda was making sure the world finally saw exactly what was inside the frame that Constance Bennett had tried so hard to keep closed. I did not wait for the dust to settle on my mother's grave, or for my siblings to finish their greedy inventory of the Bennett estate, because the numbers in my restitution spreadsheet demanded immediate action, a cold and calculated pursuit of the legacy that had been vibrating beneath the surface of my life for 31 years. At precisely 9 a.m. on Monday morning, I stood before a formidable 3-story red brick building in the heart of the historic district, a structure that projected the kind of architectural arrogance only centuries of old money can buy, with heavy limestone lintels and hand-polished brass lettering that identified the firm of Whitfield, Sterling, and Associates. This was the fortress where the Prescott secrets were kept under lock and key, and as I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, the climate-controlled air inside smelled of beeswax, expensive leather, and the quiet, muffled hush of extreme wealth. I was met by a receptionist whose pearl necklace looked like it cost more than my first 2 years of college tuition, and within 10 minutes, I was being ushered into the private sanctum of James Whitfield, the executor of the Douglas Prescott estate, and a man who had likely spent his entire career ensuring that the messy realities of human life never stained the pristine reputations of his clients. James Whitfield was a man of silver hair and sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to calculate my net worth before I even crossed the threshold of his office, which was lined with first-edition legal texts and a floor-to-ceiling view of the manicured gardens behind the courthouse. I didn't offer a polite preamble or a daughter's grief. Instead, I placed the cream-colored envelope on his green leather desk and watched as his composure, a shield he had likely maintained for 40 years, visibly fractured. He didn't even need to open the envelope to know who I was, because as he looked at me, his breath hitched in a way that was almost a whistle, and he whispered a sentence that fundamentally rewired my understanding of the past 3 decades. He spent $15,000 on private investigators trying to find you, James admitted, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of the building's high-efficiency HVAC system. My heart, usually a steady metronome of professional detachment, skipped a beat as the sheer scale of Constance's deception began to reveal its true depth. For 31 years, I had believed that Douglas Prescott had simply discarded me like a clerical error, but the reality was far more sinister and more tragic. My mother, Constance Bennett, had moved us 3 times before I was 10 years old, dragging us from Savannah to Charleston and finally to the quiet, stifling suburbs of Crestfield, Georgia, under the guise of chasing better real estate opportunities for Arthur. But as James Whitfield spoke, I realized those moves were tactical extractions, maneuvers designed to keep me out of the reach of a man who was desperately searching for his daughter. She had utilized at least 4 different Social Security aliases for herself and had subtly altered my records in every new school district to ensure that the trail went cold every time a private investigator got close. She didn't hide me to protect me from the shame of my birth. She hid me to ensure that Douglas Prescott would die with the hollow ache of an unsolved mystery, using my childhood as a bargaining chip in a game of vengeance that only she was playing. She would rather I grow up in a house where I was treated as a second-class citizen, working 30 hours a week at a hardware store while my siblings were pampered, than allow the man who rejected her to have the one thing he actually wanted. But Douglas Prescott, a man who understood the permanence of the law better than anyone, had left behind a failsafe that Constance's spite couldn't reach, a legal mechanism hidden deep within the fine print of his trust documents known as the biological child provision. James Whitfield stood up, his joints creaking slightly, and walked to a heavy steel safe disguised as a bookshelf, returning with a thick, blue-bound folder that represented my true inheritance. This provision was a dormant cell in the Prescott estate, a trust that could only be activated by a certified 99.9% DNA match from a laboratory approved by the American Association of Blood Banks. As I listened to James outline the specifics, my accountant's mind began to tally the figures with a clinical, almost predatory focus, and the results were staggering. The trust included a $340,000 investment portfolio managed by Vanguard, consisting of a diversified mix of high-yield municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks that had been compounding in silence for years. Furthermore, it granted me deed and title to 40 acres of prime, leased farmland on the outskirts of the county, a stretch of fertile soil that was currently generating $2,400 in monthly passive income from a local agricultural conglomerate. The final piece of the provision was perhaps the most pointed jab at the life I had been forced to lead. A luxury guest cottage located on the far eastern edge of the Prescott Estate in Hinsdale, a 1,000-square-foot architectural gem with radiant floor heating, a slate roof, and a private driveway that offered total autonomy from the main manor. When I combined the liquid assets, the appraised value of the acreage, and the equity in the cottage, the total value of my inheritance sat at exactly $622,000. I sat in the plush leather chair, the weight of that number settling over me like a suit of armor, and I realized the exquisite irony of my mother's final act. By trying to punish Douglas Prescott and by keeping me in a state of artificial poverty for 31 years, she had inadvertently protected my share of the wealth from the grasping hands of Vivian and Kyle. While they were currently screaming at each other over a $315,000 house that needed a new roof and a collection of used tools, I was suddenly, undeniably, 3 times wealthier than both of them combined. My mother's punishment had backfired with the spectacular precision of a poorly timed demolition. She wanted me to feel the sting of being nothing, to live in a 650-square-foot apartment with a clanking radiator while I counted every penny for my groceries. But her attempts to block my father had only allowed my inheritance to grow in the dark, untouched by the inflation of the Bennett family's vanity. I looked at the 2024 tax assessments for the farmland and the quarterly statements for the investment portfolio, feeling the cold, hard reality of financial freedom flooding into my veins. This wasn't just about the money, it was about the restitution of 31 years of stolen peace. James Whitfield watched me, perhaps expecting a surge of emotion or a question about the man who had authorized this trust, but I simply asked for a black ink pen. I signed the documents for the mandatory DNA testing, my signature sharp and unwavering, the same signature I had used to audit million-dollar accounts for strangers who never thanked me. As I walked out of the Whitfield fortress and back into the bright, unyielding Georgia sun, the world looked fundamentally different. I thought about the hardware store where I had mixed paint until my skin smelled of chemicals, and I thought about the 2012 Honda Civic that I had driven until the transmission groaned in protest. Those days were over. I was no longer the girl who was pushed out of the family frame. I was the girl who had inherited the entire gallery. The $4-a-pound coffee in Harold Marsh's office and the $9 bottle of Pinot Grigio in my kitchen were relics of a past life that I was officially closing the books on. My siblings would find out soon enough that the Bennett name they guarded so fiercely was a bankrupt currency, a hollow shell of a legacy that carried no weight compared to the Prescott Trust. Constance Bennett had spent her life trying to ensure that I knew my place was at the bottom of the ladder, but in her obsession with vengeance, she had accidentally handed me the ladder itself. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt since I was a child. I was going to take the DNA test, I was going to claim the $340,000, and I was going to move into that guest cottage with its private driveway and its radiant floor heating. I would walk through the gates of the Prescott estate not as a beggar or a secret, but as the legal and biological beneficiary of a man who had spent $15,000 just to find out if I was okay. The audit of my life was yielding a massive surplus, and for the first time in 31 years, the balance sheet was leaning heavily in my favor. As I reached my car, I didn't see a worn-out vehicle. I saw a temporary vessel that would soon be replaced by something that reflected my new reality. The Bennetts were about to learn that the sister they ignored was now the most powerful person in their orbit, and Douglas Prescott's unwavering fairness was finally about to be enacted through the hands of the daughter he never got to hold. The vengeance Constance had planned had turned into my victory, and the truth, as it turned out, was worth every single cent of the $622,000 that was now rightfully mine. I was done being the mistake. I was the dividend that had finally matured, and I was ready to collect. The confrontation that I now think of as the setup occurred at precisely 7 p.m. on a humid Thursday evening, a time when the sun was beginning to dip below the Chicago skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the laminate flooring of my 650-square-foot apartment. I was sitting at my circular white IKEA Docksta table, the one that cost me $200 and took 4 hours to assemble because the instructions were as fragmented as my family history, when a sharp, aggressive rapping at my door interrupted the low hum of my window unit air conditioner. When I pulled back the heavy deadbolt, I found my sister Vivian and her husband Greg standing in the hallway, looking like they had stepped out of a high-end real estate brochure, their faces set in masks of coordinated hostility. Without an invitation, Vivian pushed past me, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and threw a single-page legal document onto the table with such force that it skidded across the surface and nearly knocked over my glass of lukewarm water. "Sign this right now, Thea," she commanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and an arrogance that had been nurtured by 35 years of being the Bennett family's most precious commodity. The document was a standard voluntary relinquishment and non-disclosure agreement, drafted with a clinical coldness that requested I officially and permanently renounce the Bennett name, waive any and all future claims to the family estate, and essentially disappear into the administrative ether from which I had apparently emerged. Greg, who stood by the door in a Vineyard Vines button-down that looked far too tight around his neck, nodded in agreement as Vivian leaned over the table, her shadow eclipsing the meager light from my overhead fixture. "If you sign this, we won't tell the town you're a bastard," she hissed, the word landing in the quiet room like a physical blow, though it lacked the sting she clearly intended it to have. She didn't know that I was already 5 steps ahead of her, that tucked safely inside the inner pocket of my leather purse was a sealed laboratory report from the forensic genetics facility confirming my 99.9% match to Judge Douglas Prescott. She had spent the last week believing she held the ultimate leverage, a secret so shameful that I would willingly trade my identity just to keep it buried in the dark soil of Crestfield, Georgia. She didn't realize that for me, the truth wasn't a source of shame. It was the fuel for a transformation she couldn't even begin to comprehend. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the way her $450 Diane von Furstenberg dress struggled to hide the frantic pulsing of her jugular vein, and I remembered every exclusion, every Sunday dinner where I was the invisible child, and specifically her $60,000 wedding 3 years ago to which I was never even sent an invitation. I didn't reach for the pen she had aggressively placed on top of the paper, nor did I offer the tearful apology or the frantic negotiation she was clearly expecting from the sister she had always treated as a financial and social liability. Instead, I stood up slowly, the movement calm and deliberate, and simply pointed toward the door with a steady hand that reflected the absolute clarity of my new reality. "The Bennett name isn't a gift, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying a weight and a resonance that seemed to startle both of them, vibrating through the small space with the authority of someone who had finally finished an exhaustive audit of their own life. "It is a debt that has been compounding for 31 years, a legacy of lies and redirected resources that I am no longer interested in servicing. I am officially debt-free, and as of this moment, you and Kyle are the only ones left holding the bill for a reputation that is built on a foundation of sand." The confusion that flickered across her face was almost comical, a brief moment where her carefully constructed world of social hierarchies and inherited superiority began to crack under the pressure of my indifference. The final estate closing took place the following Tuesday at 10 a.m., but the woman who walked into the wood-paneled conference room of the probate court was no longer the overworked senior accountant who wore off-brand shoes and counted pennies for her grocery budget. I wore a $600 tailored navy suit made of fine Italian wool that fit me like a second skin, providing a silhouette of professional power that made Vivian's silk wrap dress look like a costume. I carried a full-grain leather briefcase that I had purchased as a celebratory investment, a piece of craftsmanship that cost more than Kyle's entire monthly rent and felt substantial in my grip. When I entered the room, the air seemed to shift, the lawyers pausing in their hushed conversations as they took in the transformation of the sister they had previously dismissed as a footnote in the Bennett ledger. Vivian and Kyle were already seated at the long mahogany table, looking smaller and more frantic than I had ever seen them, their eyes darting to the briefcase as if it contained the very explosives that would dismantle their lives. I took my seat at the head of the table, not because I was invited to, but because the numbers I now possessed demanded it. I placed the DNA results and the executed documents from the Prescott Trust directly in the center of the table, the bright white paper contrasting sharply with the dark wood. The lawyer, Marcus Thorne, looked at the documents through his silver-rimmed spectacles, his silence stretching for several seconds as he processed the fact that the Bennett estate was no longer the primary concern of the morning. I wasn't there to beg for a portion of the $315,000 house on Maple Drive or to argue over the distribution of the $47,000 in savings that had been left to the church. I was there to close the books on the Bennett chapter of my life and to step into the Prescott legacy with the full force of the law behind me. Vivian tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but I silenced her with a single sharp look that conveyed more authority than our mother had ever exerted in 31 years. The technical details of the closing were handled with a surgical efficiency that I had mastered over a decade of high-stakes financial reporting. As the executors walked through the final distribution of Constance's assets, I watched Vivian and Kyle realize that while they were inheriting a crumbling house and a set of used tools, I was stepping into an investment portfolio and a land lease that would provide me with more passive income in a year than they had earned in their entire lives. The $2,400 in monthly income from the leased farmland was just the beginning. The guest cottage in Hinsdale was being prepared for my arrival, and the $340,000 investment portfolio was already being restructured by my own hand to maximize long-term growth. I watched the color drain from Kyle's face as he realized that the sister he had mocked for driving a 2012 Honda Civic was now in a position to buy and sell his entire lifestyle without breaking a sweat. As the meeting concluded and the final signatures were notarized, the atmosphere in the room was one of profound, irreversible change. I stood up, tucked my documents into my expensive briefcase, and didn't offer a single word of farewell to the people who shared my past, but would have no place in my future. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, crisp morning air, feeling the weight of the navy suit and the solidity of the leather handle in my hand. The debt was settled, the audit was complete, and for the first time in 31 years, the balance sheet of my life was not just equalized, it was overflowing. I wasn't a Bennett, and I was no longer a secret. I was a woman who had used the very stones thrown at her to build a fortress of her own. As I signaled for a car to take me toward Hinsdale, I realized that the girl who worked at the hardware store and the accountant who lived in the small apartment had served their purpose. They had survived the drought so that I could inherit the harvest. The Bennett name was a bankrupt currency, and I was walking away with the gold. The story of the girl who didn't fit in the frame was over. The story of the woman who owned the gallery had just begun, and the first thing I planned to do was ensure that the frame was wide enough to hold nothing but the truth. The silence of the drive toward my new home was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A quiet testament to the fact that when you stop carrying the weight of other people's lies, you finally have the strength to carry the weight of your own power, The event that the local social circles would later whisper about, as the public execution did not take place under the shimmering chandeliers of a country club ballroom or during a tense family dinner, but rather on the cold, unforgiving granite steps of the Crestfield County Courthouse at precisely 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain and the exhaust from the idling news vans of 3 local reporters who had caught wind of a high-stakes probate dispute involving the Bennett name. Vivian had orchestrated this confrontation, believing that a public show of force would intimidate me into submission, and she stood near the towering bronze doors of the courthouse flanked by her husband Greg and a junior associate from a cut-rate law firm she had hired to challenge the title transfer of our mother's house on Maple Drive. She was dressed in a structured, cream-colored wool coat that cost nearly $1,200, clutching a designer handbag as if it were a shield. And as I approached, she began a loud, performative oration for the benefit of the small crowd, claiming that the final will of Constance Bennett had been distorted and that I was a fraudulent interloper attempting to steal the family's modest $315,000 legacy. I did not meet her with the high-pitched vitriol she expected, nor did I engage in the undignified shouting match she had clearly rehearsed in her mind. Instead, I walked up those steps with a clinical, terrifying composure, flanked by Harold Marsh and James Whitfield, who represented the 2 halves of the truth that were about to collide with the force of a high-speed wreck. I was wearing my $600 tailored navy suit, my silver-rimmed glasses catching the flat, gray light of the morning as I reached the landing where the court clerk stood with a clipboard, waiting to notarize the final property documents. Vivian's voice was a sharp, jagged edge in the quiet morning air as she hissed about family honor and the sanctity of the Bennett bloodline. But her momentum faltered when James Whitfield stepped forward and opened a high-quality leather portfolio to reveal the DNA certification and the original trust documents signed by Judge Douglas Prescott. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the rapid-fire clicking of a camera shutter from one of the reporters and the distant, rhythmic thud of a construction crew working on a nearby street. I took the DNA results, a document printed on official laboratory letterhead with a 99.9% probability of paternity, and held it out not to Vivian, but to the court clerk, ensuring the reporters had a clear view of the seal. While my mother, Constance, spent 31 years meticulously curating the image of the perfect, respectable Bennett family, she was actually engaged in a systematic campaign of legal and financial fraud by intentionally hiding a primary heir from the Prescott estate, I stated, my voice projecting with a professional resonance that cut through Vivian's frantic posturing. The realization hit the crowd like a physical shockwave, the whispers starting instantly as the town's golden girl was stripped of her narrative in the most public forum imaginable. I explained, with the cold precision of a senior accountant, that by suppressing the truth of my birth and my father's identity, Constance had not only denied me my heritage, but had also exposed the entire Bennett estate to massive retroactive liabilities that were now coming due with crushing interest. Vivian's face began to change in a way I will never forget, her pale, porcelain complexion turning a mottled, bruised purple as the absolute reality of her situation began to penetrate the thick layers of her denial. She had spent weeks gloating over her $315,000 inheritance, viewing the house on Maple Drive as the ultimate prize for her loyalty to Constance's lies. But as Whitfield began to detail the legal implications of the omitted heir status, she looked as though she might collapse onto the granite steps. Because I was intentionally omitted through fraudulent concealment, a legal lien was being placed on all assets previously belonging to Constance Bennett to satisfy the restitution requirements of the Prescott Trust, a move that effectively froze the title of the Maple Drive house and turned her supposed windfall into a toxic asset burdened by years of unpaid legal obligations and interest. The house she loved, the house she had used to belittle me and reinforce my status as a guest in my own life, was no longer hers to inhabit or sell. It was a collateral piece in a much larger, much more expensive game of forensic accounting. The three local reporters moved in closer, their microphones extended like silver thorns as they scrambled to capture the fall of Crestfield's most prominent family. Vivian's husband, Greg, stepped back, his face pale and his eyes darting toward their luxury SUV parked at the curb, sensing that the Bennett name was no longer a social asset, but a mounting professional liability. Kyle was nowhere to be found, likely hiding in his truck at a nearby bar, but Vivian was trapped in the center of the frame she had built for herself. I stood my ground, my hands steady as I signed the final title transfer documents for the Prescott guest cottage and the 40 acres of farmland, my signature a sharp final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I looked directly into Vivian's eyes, seeing the raw, unadulterated fear beneath her expensive mascara, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for her, no anger, no spite, and certainly no pity. She was the one who had demanded this public forum. She was the one who had insisted on a trial by fire, and now she was the only one burning. The public execution of the Bennett reputation was systematic and total, a demolition of a 3-generation facade that had relied on the silence of a girl they thought they could break. As the court clerk stamped the documents with a heavy, metallic thud, I realized that the 12 by 15-foot wood-paneled office where this journey began was merely the foyer to this moment of absolute, legal clarity. The town watched as the perfect Bennett family crumbled under the weight of a single sheet of paper and a 99.9% match, the whispers of adultery and fraud echoing off the limestone walls of the courthouse. I handed my briefcase to Harold Marsh, thanked him for his time with a brief, professional nod, and began my descent down the steps, moving past the reporters and the stunned onlookers with the easy, graceful stride of a woman who finally knew exactly what she was worth. I didn't need to look back to know that Vivian was still standing there, a ghost in a cream-colored coat, clutching a handbag that was worth more than her remaining dignity. Now, let me take you back to the feeling of the wind on my face as I reached the sidewalk, a cool, refreshing breeze that seemed to sweep away the last lingering scent of the hardware store and the cramped, suffocating atmosphere of Magnolia Drive. My mother had intended for the truth to be my exile, a way to ensure I lived in the shadow of my siblings' reflected glory forever, but she had failed to account for the fact that shadows cannot survive in the light of an audit. I was no longer the girl who was pushed out of the family portrait. I was the one who had burned the gallery and built something permanent in its place. The $315,000 house was a small price to pay for the look of absolute, soul-crushing realization on Vivian's face as she understood that the debt was finally being collected. The Bennett name was officially bankrupt, a currency that could no longer buy silence or status in this town, and I was the one holding the only solvent account left. I reached my car, a sleek, reliable vehicle that I had leased using the first installment of my passive income from the farmland, and I didn't feel the need to celebrate or gloat. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a ledger that had finally balanced, of a life that had moved from a deficit into a massive, undeniable surplus. As I drove away from the courthouse, leaving the reporters and the mottled purple face of my sister behind me, I looked at the 40-acre estate and the guest cottage on my GPS and felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with justice. The public execution was over, the facade was gone, and the daughter who was worth nothing in the eyes of Constance Bennett was now the only one with the resources to walk into the future without looking back. Family isn't the lies you tell to protect a reputation. Family is the truth that survives when the reputation is gone, and on the steps of that courthouse, I finally found my real family in the ironclad, unwavering fairness of a father who had been looking for me until his very last breath. I was Thea Prescott, and the world was finally going to see me in high definition, exactly where I belonged, at the very center of the frame. Today, I live in the Prescott Guest Cottage, a sanctuary of 1,200 square feet of weathered cedar, hand-cut fieldstone, and floor-to-ceiling tempered glass that overlooks the rolling pecan groves of the Hinsdale estate, where the morning mist clings to the low-hanging branches like a silver shroud. The cottage is an architectural masterpiece of mid-century modern design, featuring vaulted ceilings with exposed hemlock beams and radiant floor heating that keeps the slate tiles at a constant, comforting 74 degrees, regardless of the brutal Chicago winters howling outside. My life is now measured in the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the countryside, rather than the frantic, high-pitched demands of my former existence in a 650-square-foot apartment with a radiator that clanked like a dying engine. Every morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., I sit at my walnut writing desk, a bespoke piece that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and watch the sun rise over the 40 acres of leased farmland that provide me with a steady, passive income of $2,400 every single month. This cottage wasn't just a bequest. It was an admission of existence from a man who spent $15,000 on private investigators trying to find the daughter my mother had worked so tirelessly to erase from the narrative of his life. The silence here is expensive, a luxury I never thought I would possess while I was mixing paint at Miller's Hardware or auditing the complex tax returns of multimillionaires who didn't know my name. But the most significant change in my life isn't the real estate or the $340,000 investment portfolio that continues to compound in a Vanguard brokerage account. It is the unexpected olive branch from a side of the family I didn't know I had. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, I receive an email from Maggie Prescott, my biological half-sister, a 34-year-old human rights attorney who possesses the same downward tilt of the eyes and the same analytical mind that I see in my own reflection. Her messages are devoid of the toxic competition and the performance-based affection that defined my years with Vivian and Kyle, consisting instead of book recommendations, updates on the Hinsdale Estate's conservation efforts, and genuine inquiries into my well-being. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 a.m., we are meeting for coffee at a small, high-end bistro in the village, a neutral ground where the espresso costs $6 and the conversation is worth infinitely more than 31 years of Bennett family lies. While my world has expanded into a landscape of autonomy and truth, the world of the Bennetts is systematically collapsing under the weight of its own structural rot, proving that a legacy built on fraud and exclusion cannot survive the cold scrutiny of a forensic audit. Vivian is currently trapped in a desperate, high-stakes financial maneuver, attempting to refinance the 3-bedroom house on Maple Drive, the very house she once used as a weapon of superiority, to pay for her husband Greg's mounting gambling debts, which have reportedly surpassed the $80,000 mark. The house, once valued at $315,000, is now a millstone around her neck, burdened by the massive legal lien I placed upon it for my status as a fraudulently omitted heir, a debt that Constance is no longer around to bail them out of with her secret accounts and redirected funds. I heard through the grapevine of Crestfield's dwindling social circles that Vivian was seen at a local consignment shop trying to sell the designer dresses she once wore like armor, her porcelain complexion now permanently etched with the fine lines of chronic, unmitigated stress. The collapse of the Bennett hierarchy hasn't spared Kyle either, whose life was always a fragile construction of parental indulgence and unearned confidence that couldn't withstand the absence of a safety net. His 2024 Oxford White Ford F-150 Lariat, the vehicle he treated as a birthright rather than a gift, was repossessed by the bank exactly 3 weeks ago after he missed 4 consecutive monthly payments of $680. He is currently living in a rented room above a garage, his high-end power tools sold off to pay for back taxes and bar tabs, a stark contrast to the life of leisure he assumed would be his forever, simply because of the name on his birth certificate. They are the heirs to a vacuum, the beneficiaries of a woman who loved them not for who they were, but for how well they helped her maintain the lie of a perfect Southern family. Now that the lie has been dismantled by a 99.9% DNA match and a cream-colored envelope, they are discovering that the Bennett name is a bankrupt currency that can no longer buy them a seat at any table of consequence. I sit on my cedar deck as the evening shadows stretch across the pecan trees, sipping a glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon that cost $85, a far cry from the $9 Pinot Grigio I used to drink while staring at my laptop in a cramped kitchen. I am no longer the girl who was intentionally cropped out of the family portrait to make room for people who didn't actually belong in the frame. I am the woman who owns the camera, the one who decides the focus, the lighting, and the depth of field for her own life. My mother, Constance, thought she was delivering a final, crushing death blow by leaving me nothing but a confession in blue Bic ink, an act of spite intended to leave me wandering in the wilderness of my own identity. She didn't realize that by stripping away the Bennett facade, she was giving me the coordinates to a kingdom that was rightfully mine, a place where the truth is the only baseline for entry, and where my worth is not a subject of debate, but a matter of legal record. The 40-acre estate is more than just land. It is a physical manifestation of the restitution I earned through 3 decades of silent endurance and disciplined self-reliance. When I walk through the groves, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke filling my lungs, I feel the presence of Douglas Prescott, a man I never met, but whose legacy provided me with the armor I needed to face the world. He was a judge who valued unwavering fairness, and in the end, the law he served so faithfully ensured that his daughter wasn't left in the shadows. The transition from a senior accountant in a 650-square-foot apartment to a woman of independent means in a cedar and glass cottage wasn't a stroke of luck. It was an inevitability, the result of a life that was lived according to the cold, hard facts of the balance sheet. I spent 27 years trying to belong to a family that was built on a foundation of theft, and I spent 5 years learning that the only family worth having is the one that chooses you when the masks are finally removed. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., when I sit across from Maggie and watch the way she tilts her head just like I do, I will not feel the familiar sting of being an outsider or the heavy burden of being someone's mistake. I will be Thea Prescott, a woman whose history is no longer a secret kept in a cream-colored envelope, but a life being lived in the bright, unyielding light of day. The Bennetts can keep their crumbling house and their repossessed dreams, for they are the ones who are truly in exile now, wandering the ruins of a reputation that was never as solid as they believed. I look at the family portrait that I've started to build for myself, not an oil painting on a marble fireplace, but a collection of real moments, honest conversations, and financial security that no one can take away from me. Family isn't the blood that runs through your veins or the last name on a legal document. Family is the foundation you build for yourself when the people who were supposed to protect you decide to tear you down for the sake of their own vanity. My name is Thea Prescott. I am 31 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not a footnote or a glitch in someone else's high-definition photo. I am the primary subject, the one who stands in the center of the frame, and the view from here is clearer than I ever imagined it could be. As the lights in the main manor flicker on in the distance and the owls begin their nightly vigil in the pecan trees, I close my eyes and feel the profound, bone-deep satisfaction of a life that has finally reached equilibrium. The audit of the Bennett and Prescott legacies is complete, the debts have been collected, and the surplus is mine to keep. I have found my truth in the cedar and glass, in the Sunday emails and the Monday morning coffee dates, and in the quiet realization that being someone's daughter was never about the space in a frame, but about the space in a heart. And finally, after 31 years, I have found where I truly belong. The story of my exile is over, and the history of my reign has just begun.